This evening on The Rock Newman Show, way back in the day, U Street was known as the Black Broadway. Today, U Street is as popular as ever, but struggling to maintain its original cultural identity. We'll explore that with my guest, historian Sandra Butler-Truesdale, filmmaker Shalay Haynesworth, and Kamal Ben Ali of U Street's iconic Ben's Chili Bowl. That's coming up right now on The Rock Newman Show. Welcome to The Rock Newman Show from the campus of historic Howard University, located right here in the nation's capital. I'm Rock Newman, and it is my desire to inspire you with personal stories of extraordinary achievement. Once upon a time, U Street was a glamorous boulevard known as the Black Broadway, a place where nightclubs reigned and the Lincoln and Howard theaters were safe venues for some of Black America's most cherished performing artists. A lot has changed since then, but U Street remains as popular as ever. Tonight, we'll return to those glory days with my guest, author and historian Sandra Butler-Truesdale, Black Broadway documentary filmmaker Shalay Haynesworth, and Kamal Ben Ali of Ben's Chili Bowl, home base of the Half Smoke. Thank you guys for joining me today. If you might be able to tell by the smile on my face, this is a subject that I am embracing and happy to be talking about. Sandra, since you pretend that you're the senior amongst us when we really know you're not, I want to come to you first. You know, Florida Avenue connects with U Street. And before we go to U Street proper, probably my favorite male entertainer is a guy by the name of Marvin Gaye. Yeah. And I know that you have some history with Marvin Gaye. So I would like to start this walk down memory lane with your observation and reflection on your time and with Marvin Gaye back in the day.
Well, you know, Marvin and I both went to Cardozo Senior High School.
Which is right there on Florida Avenue and 13th Street.
Well, actually, it's at 13th and Clifton.
Mm-hmm, but I'm saying it's all there.
That's that whole,
connects.
Yes. And Marvin and I took music together from a man whose name, the musician, his name was William Finley. And what people don't know is Mr. Finley, after Marvin sort of kind of left church, Mr. Finley is the one who got Marvin interested in having a career in music. I just can remember us going to the 3rd floor at Cardozo High School and sitting in the room. He sat behind me. And what people also don't know is Marvin was a boy soprano. And you could hear him in the halls of Cardozo, even at lunchtime, in the evening when we left school. He was always singing. And I always tell people he was a handsome dude. You know what I'm saying? And if I had had anything in my head, I would have been flirting with him, even as the, I mean, because he was good looking. But and he was smart. He and H.R. Crawford are two people that I knew who seemed to have always known what they wanted to do. He always knew he wanted to do music. And so, and the other thing about him is he was always a gentleman. And so that's the other thing that I really liked about him. Marvin lived in several areas of Washington, D.C. He lived out in Northeast, he lived in Southwest, and he finally ended up living in Northwest, right outside of Petworth, on Webster Street. And so, but we had a real good relationship because he was a lot of fun.
Let me go back to the other lady here at the table. So Shelly, you are doing Shalay, you're doing a plethora of projects. You have a plethora of projects underway. Can you please let us know what it is that you're doing, because you've been studying this U Street corridor for a good amount of time, and you have come up with some research that whenever your final project gets done, it's going to be not just a home run, but a grand slam. So clue us in as to what it is you're doing, what initially got you so interested, and what it is you're doing now, and how people can join you in the process of the documentary that you're doing.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Rock. So essentially, my story began with, in spring 2013, I was inspired to launch the Black Broadway on U project, which is a multi-platform project, after driving down U Street with my grandmother, who was actually a part-time barber on U Street in the 50s and 60s at Eaton's Barbershop, which was located a few doors down from Club Caverns. Back in the day it was called Club Caverns, and eventually it became Bohemian Caverns. But traveling through U Street in spring 2013, she had no idea where she was. My grandmother's 98 now, so at that time she was 92. But she began to tell the story of what U Street was and what it was like when she came here. She migrated to the U Street corridor in July of 1932, and earlier we were talking about how driving a cab was a very prominent occupation. Well, she moved here with her older brother on 936 Westminster, and he was a cab driver.
Right.
So, and he actually literally drove to Louisiana and brought them here when they were displaced from their property. So that's what
cab driving Mama Jamba.
Yes, yes, and that was
Sure,
part of what
we did.
a good career path for us back in the 30s. And so basically, in that moment when she was telling the story, I was inspired to launch the Black Broadway on U project. And so, as I began my research, and then also what sort of came to my mind was they didn't teach me this history, growing up.
Yes.
My grandmother talked about it here and there, and there were actually people all around me who played a very significant role into the DNA and the fabric of the community, like Shep Allen.
Yeah.
I had no idea, that I was sitting next to Shep Allen growing up. So anyway, I decided to create a digital footprint, because the history was out there, but it was scattered.
Yeah.
And so I launched the website, which is the first component of it, blackbroadwayonu.com. And so I created a map, an interactive map. We'll be adding, I have some stories where I've taken some of the oral histories that I've documented and created stories. But, because we're talking about where we are now. It's about telling stories at the intersection of technology.
Yeah.
And so that's the thrust of the project. It's a Black storytelling project at the intersection of technology.
I am not looking to steal any of the documentary's thunder, but we're going to come back to some of those oral histories, because I know
I have some amazing voices.
I know it's rich.
Well, and I'm so thankful because I've had an opportunity to film many elders, because the whole goal of the project at large is community based, but it's to tell the authentic story through the lens of the actual stakeholders, the people, the history makers.
Yeah.
And so many of the elders that I filmed over the last 6 years, they have gone on. And I'm just so thankful that I have their story.
Yeah. So let me turn to the handsome gentleman here in the middle. And you mentioned cab drivers.
Yes,
And,
that's a good segue.
and Kamal Ali from Ben's Chili Bowl, the family. Kamal Ali's your dad. Spent time as a cab driver.
He did.
Tell us about, because right now when you think about U Street, there perhaps is nothing more iconic on U Street than what is Ben's Chili Bowl.
Absolutely.
And so please tell us, your dad, just give us a snapshot of your dad's journey coming to the States, and then ultimately opening what is now the most iconic landmark on U Street, arguably.
Yeah, well, my dad came from Trinidad. He was the oldest of 7, and his dad was what they called an indentured servant in the oil fields of Trinidad, originally from India. And Dad came over from Trinidad to get his education, to go to university. Started out at University of Nebraska, University of Scranton, and then he ended up at Howard University, where he graduated from Howard and ended up going to medical school at Howard, but dental school actually. But he hurt his back and then fell down an elevator shaft, was unable to complete his studies.
Right.
He ended up, again, so along the way, he was a cab driver. He was Capital 718 was his cab. We were going to name one of the restaurants behind him. And he also did odd jobs, like worked in restaurants. So he worked his way up through university at restaurants. So he performed all the different tasks of, you know, being a busboy and being a dishwasher and being a waiter, et cetera, you know, and being a maitre d' at restaurants. And so he decided to go into the restaurant business, and where better than U Street?
Yeah.
Opening in 1958, he and Mom from Industrial Bank.
Yeah.
Mom was the head teller down at Industrial Bank, and she was real pretty and could count that money real fast, he said. And he told her one day, he came in there in line and said, I'm going to marry you. And he was a little forward.
Yeah.
Mom was a little reserved.
Yeah.
She didn't pay him any attention.
Yeah.
He was persistent enough. You know, a lot of love connections happened there on that U Street corridor.
Sure.
You know.
Yeah.
But,
and he's talking, of course, his mom, who is there and has some kind of miracle potion that doesn't cause her to age. We're talking about Virginia Ali.
Yeah.
Actually, I was there and saw her yesterday. Yeah. And just what a treasure she remains. Sandra, let me come back here to you. So we talked about Marvin Gaye. So when we talk about the glory, glory days of U Street, we could start anywhere again. But let's talk about first Duke Ellington. Let's talk about the Duke.
Well, you know, Duke Ellington is another one like Marvin Gaye. People claim him from a lot of areas in Northwest Washington, D.C. He went to Armstrong High School along with my uncle, my uncle was the drum major at Armstrong. And Duke Ellington, according to my uncle, was already playing piano even then. One of the things my uncle always told me about him is that his mother and his parents kept him uniquely dressed, and he was always just so as a young man. He graduated from Armstrong, I do believe, and this man, I remember as a little girl sitting in the Howard Theater with my mother, listening to Duke Ellington tinkle the keys, and he was just so fabulous. You know, as a little girl watching that performance, the dignity of this man was something that's very different. It may not be, you know, what our young people see as they are performing today, because as chair of the DC Legendary Musicians, I try real hard to inspire our young people to emulate a Duke Ellington. But this man was a genius.
I want to tap into something that you just mentioned there about how his family always had him so impeccably dressed. And getting, you know, I'd like for us to think about the psychology that goes into that. Because what you're doing when you do that with a child is reinforcing a sense of identity in that child, that they are special.
Yes.
And there was like never a time, it's like ever, when there wasn't a sense that Duke Ellington, long before Jesse Jackson ever said it, Duke Ellington was somebody.
Yes, and he knew it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, and you could tell, but not only was Duke Ellington somebody, but everybody on Sundays and Saturdays, black people came to U Street to transact their business because they couldn't go downtown to do so.
Right.
And so, but they would dare not come to U Street not properly attired.
Yes.
You know, particularly on Sundays when they were going to church. See, I came out of this neighborhood.
Sure.
So I learned as a little girl, as I watched my mother and her four sisters and Miss Ali, who was at Industrial Bank, attire themselves, and not just attire themselves, but act in a certain way. Dignified.
Proud.
Pride.
And proper.
Yes.
You see,
yes.
and they taught you that in school as well, because they had domestic sciences in the DC public schools. They taught you how to dress, how to sit, how to cross your legs at the ankle, and how to hold your hands. All of these things were taught they didn't wait for your parents to teach.
Sure.
Even though your parents did do that. But the DC public schools taught you that, and that's how I became the lady that I know how to be.
Shelley, she's talking about something there. Shelley, I keep calling you Shelley. Shelley.
You're talking about
yes,
me.
yes. So she's talking about a sense of pride, a sense of dignity, a sense of purpose. So if I could ask you to channel some of the oral history that you have from folks that have shared stories with you that can illuminate what she just brought up right there.
Yeah, I mean, because we're also talking about decorum.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so even, I mentioned my grandmother, even today,
Yeah.
she doesn't leave the house at 98 without her, best foot forward. And so basically,
She put herself together,
Well, yeah,
all the way together.
Well, because the whole notion is, if you present yourself well, then
Yeah.
people will take you seriously.
Yeah.
And that was very important back then, because we had a lot at stake.
Yeah.
And so, for a lot of the, oral histories that I've conducted, to piggyback on what Dr. Truesdale said, they didn't come on U Street without a tie. Women wore gloves. They had hats, because that was part of the decorum.
Yeah.
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 And so I've gotten that a lot from the elders that I've interviewed thus far for the project.
Come on with a hat. Come on with
gloves.
Because let's deal with this, because there was a sense that this is ours.
Yes.
We can't go down there. We can't go down to Landsberg. We can't go downtown to the Heck Company and all of that. But this is ours.
Yes.
And we're going to treat it in a very special manner.
Yes, because and again, it's about presentation. Because if you want people to take you seriously and really listen to what you have to say, and you're representing, as I said, a lot was at stake. So when you went out there, you were representing not only yourself, you were representing the community. And I think that's something that we really need to instill in our young people and just our community at large, because today I think we're more self-oriented, more self-centered, and we really got to get more centered into representing our entire village.
So Kamal, I know that you were born in the early 60s.
That's right, 62.
It's 1962. So, but you weren't born so late that you weren't aware of some of the underworld which helped fuel the legitimacy,
The ecosystem.
That's right, the ecosystem. That's a good term.
Yeah, well, that's what
of Hugh Street. So, if you wouldn't mind, and we're not trying to whitewash anything here. There is a real history, and some of that hustler activity is a part of that history. What's some of your memories on that?
Yeah, well, I was born in 62, so unfortunately, I don't have the great memories from 58 when the Chili Bowl opened to 62, some of these glory days. So I really relish in hearing and seeing any photos that are available for those types of things. But yeah, when I came up, so my memories are mainly in the late 70s, late 70s. So early 70s, U Street still had numbers. Numbers were big.
Yeah.
The numbers business was huge in the black community.
Some of
Up to
our
the
viewers
90s.
right now, don't know what you're talking about when you say numbers.
Yes.
Explain that,
Right.
please.
The illegal numbers, where there was a number that was called in the community, and you pay your nickel, a dime, or quarter, or whatever it was to play your number, and that number would come out there, and you get paid. It's like the lottery. So we're talking about the lottery, guys.
Yeah.
Let's use that word so everyone understands that we're talking about the lottery.
Long before the lottery was
existed.
That's right. That's
They
right.
co-opted
The numbers.
That's right.
They co-opted that.
And the really good ones, and the really good numbers runners, as Richard Pryor says in one of his stand-up routines, book the numbers without pencil nor paper.
Without
That's
pencil,
right,
and
that's right.
could remember.
Yes.
There was a gentleman called Slim Hall that walked 9th Street who never carried a book.
Yeah.
And he never missed a hit.
Yeah,
But
he-
why didn't they do it? Because that's evidence.
That's
Yeah.
evidence.
That's evidence against
Yeah.
it.
Sure.
So it was
Sure.
an illegal activity.
But-
Now it's very legal.
You had the dream
the
books.
important-
Remember the dream books with all the numbers?
Oh, yeah.
You had
Oh,
a
yeah.
dream. You went to the dream book.
Right.
That's the number.
Right.
When did the last time? I mean, it was a science.
Right.
Yeah.
People
But
studied it. I mean,
there are people like Mr. Lindsay. Mr. Lindsay lived in the 1700 block of Swan Street. And he and my uncle Shorty Taylor, was connected with Mr. Wilmer, who had Wilmer's Park.
Yeah.
My uncle did Mr. Wilmer's promotions, but my uncle
Hold
wrote,
on, because we're not going to speed. We're not going to speed past
Mr.
with Mr. Wilmer
Right.
or Wilmer's Park.
Oh, yeah.
Because Mr. Wilmer owned Wilmer's Park.
Exactly.
And was his driveway into Wilmer's Park was 1/4 mile from the driveway where I grew up in a little tiny house down in Brandywine, Maryland.
Yeah, in
so when you
Brandywine.
mention Mr. Wilmer, that's something real special to
It
me.
is. And let me tell you, I mean, those things, and I just want the names that they called each other.
Yeah.
White Top Simpkins.
Yeah.
White Child.
Yeah.
And White Child was as dark as this table, but they called him White Child, him and his brother. They called him Yella.
Yeah.
And then there was Geechee Charlie, and then there was Black Prince,
Yeah.
and then there, it was my Uncle Shorty Taylor, and everybody knew. And the other thing, that these people had character,
Yeah.
they had courage. These people bought houses for people. They paid car notes. They sent people to college. They saw young people walking up and down U Street and said, "Son, why are you not in school?"
Yeah.
And they sent them to school. And more important, do you know how many young people that they sent and paid their college tuition so that they could be doctors and lawyers?
Yes, yeah, and you know one thing,
They
man,
were the early
so,
VCs.
and the sentence, and the reality is that were they practicing what was at the time illicit behavior? Because now some of the drugs that they're selling, people are making billions off of. The numbers that they were running, the states are making billions off of. But
yes.
there was a genuine sense, and I rarely hear this brought out, and I'm really glad, Sandra, that you lifted it. And there was a real sense that they were doing what they were doing. Judge it how you will. But part of what was happening is there were some real Robin Hoods in the community that were doing exactly what you were talking. They were doing that hustling, and then they'd find a kid who had some promise and get behind him, spur him, and he might have ended up being Dr. So-and-so.
The other thing about that, the police department, you have to look at that in a whole different manner, because they knew what was going on, and they sort of kind of had a blind eye to what was going on, because they knew. And during those times, see, people weren't killing each other. They weren't doing all kinds. They weren't robbing each other. They were looking out for each other. And as I said earlier, there were hustlers we have a different definition of a hustler. Those guys looked out for our young people and young women. I dare not walk to U Street and some of those numberbackers saw me and would not be on the phone calling my grandmother, whose table they sat under a lot on. Because let me tell you something else. People paid their rent by having Friday and Saturday dinners. They had a fish fry on Saturday, and they cooked chicken and potato salad and collard greens and cornbread. And so the police came and sat under my grandmother's table because they wanted to eat good food. And
Buy a plate.
Buy a plate.
And
that's how they paid the
there
house
was a
note.
relationship, and an understanding, and an
That's right.
appreciation,
An
and an
appreciation.
appreciation. We can't whitewash that. There was still racism, oppression, and the rest, but they understood. City Hall understood the vibrancy, the economic vibrancy of what was happening there at places like the Howard Theater, at places like the Lincoln Theater, but also they understood that this underground economy was also helping it was helping the economy overall, and that in large part had to do with the turning of the eye. Plus, a whole lot of them were participating in some of that economy.
And they also,
Absolutely.
we have to add that they also were, we're talking about the significance of, these number of backers or runners. They also were investing in black businesses.
Correct.
Yes.
Black
Correct.
businesses
Absolutely.
couldn't go
Yeah.
get
They couldn't.
loans,
Yeah.
downtown at the majority-owned banks.
Right.
You get a loan in an industrial bank.
Yeah.
But they also played a huge part in financing a lot of the businesses, a lot of the clubs, outside of probably, quite possibly, Republic Gardens and some of the other smaller venues, the Casbah and Club Benghazi, and it goes on and on.
Yeah, you
But-
mentioned, someone mentioned before Bohemian Cavern.
Bohemian
it was
Caverns.
Club Caverns, you know,
Mm-hmm.
but of course that opened in the 1920s. Crystal Caverns, but
Yeah.
they also were underwriting black businesses and business owners, which was important,
Right.
because again, as we talk about the ecosystem, that's what fueled it. We couldn't get loans.
And a very important thing to understand about all this is that it was one community.
It was
Yeah.
one.
It wasn't a rich black community and a
That's
poor
right.
black community. It was
Yeah.
blue collar and white collar side by side due to segregation.
Absolutely.
So
Right.
it made us a stronger community,
Yeah. Yes.
having those people side by side. So it was for everybody.
I'm telling
But you
you,
know what?
which
City
brings,
within a
just
city.
a second, which
Yes.
brings one to a very fundamental argument, which is propagated by many, but if you just stay with one, which is Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm, that talked about whether or not there was wisdom in this rush to integration, to go spend all the money that you made in these kinds of pots of vibrancy, to spend that money that came out of there. If you spend all your money going to their restaurants and to their hotels and to their stores, what happens to your own? And today, when we see so many communities blighted, there's a direct connection there.
Yes.
Definitely. How many times does the dollar circulate within the community?
Yes.
And in the Jewish community, how many? And in the Asian community, how many?
Yeah.
In the black
and
community,
what
how
we're
many?
talking about is a glory time when it's much different than now. It circulates in the black community now like none.
Right, 6
Exactly.
hours.
However,
Exactly.
It's out.
during that time of segregation,
Yes.
it circulated and it grew these
It
communities.
manifested.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes,
it was
but the
manifested.
other thing about,
Yeah.
I just want to touch on that just a little bit, because my father, Wilhelmina Rolark, and the Yeldells, they were all involved in that movement to integrate.
Yeah.
And now if you look at it, Monday morning quarterbacking, you
Yeah.
say, oh no, it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
But let me tell you a part of why that was. When you sit in a classroom and you get books from the school over in Georgetown that has, the book is old
Yeah.
and it's tattered, and when you look at it, you see the name of another school,
Yeah.
and you find out, oh, well, I can't go to that school.
Right.
I lived one block from Roosevelt. Once when my mother married and moved to Petworth, I lived one block from Roosevelt, but I had to walk from 8th and Varnum to 13th and Clifton to go to Cardozo, and
Because
walk right
of
on
segregation.
past
Yeah.
Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And so they were trying to get some equality.
Yeah.
That's what that was about. When you are a
we
black
understand.
woman,
Yeah, that was obviously a noble effort.
You know, you can go to
Obviously,
Hex,
of course.
but you can't try on clothes.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's something about them wanting to integrate that city, but when you look at
Yeah,
it,
to have full citizenship.
Yes,
Well, and quite
exactly.
honestly, as we talk about, some of the elders that I interviewed, they actually thought by, integration would also bring more resources to the African American
did.
community. And so as we can see today, that still has not happened.
Yeah.
That ripple effect of what they had expected from integration.
Right.
So it wasn't the fact that, we just simply took our money down. We thought that there was going to be some fairness, some equity, and of course we see that didn't manifest. That ripple
I
effect
am.
didn't happen.
I'm not trying to be a poet here, but when you were talking about integration,
Yes.
I connect now in 2019 to gentrification,
yes.
which is something that is having a huge impact on the exact area that we are talking about. I'll give a personal reflection. I left out of Ben's one night around 1:30, out of Ben's Chili Bowl. It was a hot summer night. This was about 6 years ago after I just moved back to DC from Las Vegas. I've been in Las Vegas for 13 years. I'd been here from time to time, but hadn't spent a lot of time here. And when I left out, I went down the alley, made the turn on V Street, turned left on 13th Street, and at the light at 13th and U, a block up from Ben's, I saw 12 people, and 11 of them were Caucasians.
Yes.
Yes.
And this was 1:30 in the morning, and I just remembered the time when white folks wouldn't have got caught down there at that time of the night. So really kind of as a centerpiece, Kamal, you are a business and you want to obviously serve everybody because everybody's dollar is green. Tell us, what you've observed in that process of gentrification, because right now, I don't know if anybody's ever done a survey, but when you walk in the bins, it's typically more Caucasians than it is African Americans.
Yes, and that was a big shift. And that shift, since the Metro opened and the Metro construction, which was one of the most devastating times for U Street and us, was the Green Line Metro construction.
I didn't know if you guys could survive. That was
horrible. It happened from
Yeah.
86 to 92 in that time frame. It was anticipated long before that, but it ended up actually happening in 86 to 92. And during that time, Industrial Bank, where Mom used to work, Lee's Floors, Florida Avenue Grill, and ourselves are four of the only businesses that were able to sustain and survive. Why? It's because we owned our real estate.
That's it. That's
So
it.
at some point in the day, we rented for probably 20 years, but at some point we were able to buy our real estate. And owning our own real estate meant that nobody could triple the rent or put you out or whatever, so you could maintain. So that was a secret for us maintaining.
Right.
But but after that Metro opened and the U Street started to change and develop, first it was the young people, because they didn't have the fear, they didn't have the historic fear of the riots.
Sure.
So the young people came, and it was Mark's Club, Republic Gardens, and there was a Black
When you
Cat.
say,
Cafe.
when you say Mark,
Mark Barnes.
Mark
yeah.
Barnes, right.
And these young people pioneered with these nightclubs. It became it was always a nightclub area, but this was the new nightclubs, the new era, right? And we had punk rock clubs, and we had foreign clubs, and we had African American hip hop clubs, and we had all kinds. It was probably the most diverse time I'd ever seen U Street in a really great way. But after that, here comes the real estate boom. And that real estate boom in the 90s, where those houses, those row houses that were selling for $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a few years back are now $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. Now they're $800,000 and $900,000.
Right.
So that rise in the real estate, and then here comes the developers. Whole square blocks of land were vacant, and so here come the townhouses. Here come the apartments. Apartments are now $3,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment. It's the economics that drive the gentrification.
And you know what? It is always something so extraordinarily difficult. We can point out the gentrification and what it's doing to the culture and all that, and that's legitimate. But also sort of the economic development and the gas that goes into the tank of a municipality to try to make it a great economic engine is indeed that. The challenge becomes what it is that the municipality does and how proactive they are to try to keep the cultural identity and not lose it.
Let's just get real about this. We just had a demonstrations last night about gentrification as far as go-go is concerned, being played at, I don't know whether that's T-Mobile or whatever it is, on the corner of 7th and Florida Avenue.
That has been playing for 40 plus years.
And they had the unmitigated gall in the shade to say, oh no, you can't play this music and get a lawyer, and I'm gonna get a lawyer and stop you all. And I was so proud, even though our young people may not have done it the way I would, I was so proud of them. They blocked off 14th and U, and they went to 7th and Florida Avenue, played their music, and they said, no, you're not gonna move us out of here. We've been playing go-go ever since, they could remember. And here is if they knew, Kamal and I did something over in Northeast at the Other Ben's Chili Bowl, when here's people who moved into a neighborhood off of H Street. They knew when they moved there that it was clubs and music and it was active. These people knew when they moved in the shade that music was being played, and now here they come and they want to change the fabric of our neighborhood. And as a chair of the DC Legendary Musicians, I say no. No, we're going to support our young people. The church down the street, which is the Church of God, and the church around the corner on Florida Avenue Baptist, they haven't objected. How do you have the unmitigated gall to come into the neighborhood and say, no, we're changing this and you can't play the music?
Yeah.
But
When
getting back to those numbers,
Yeah.
getting back to the numbers game, it's the economics that drive the train.
Yes.
Yeah.
And listen, if the house is now $700,000 and $800,000 and $900,000, if the apartments are now $3,000,
Yes.
I said, and we are moving out because we can't afford it, or selling our homes because we are profiting from the grain, but we're going to move to a different quality of life somewhere else. Now what happens? So our numbers are reducing, and as outsiders' numbers increase, the old culture numbers reduces. It's a done deal.
Yeah,
It's a matter of time. And, you've been on the street for 30 years. All of a sudden, there's a new red light camera, a new speed bump in the street. What happened? We were here 30 years. They didn't do that before.
Hey, just a minute, Shelley. Before we leave fully from this and come bring it all the way to today, you mentioned Florida Avenue Grill, you mentioned Ben's Chili Bowl, you mentioned Lee's Florist, and what was the other
Industrial
one?
Industrial Bank.
And don't forget Wilson's.
Yeah.
Wilson's Kitchen, which was,
sure.
they were
So,
there on 14th and U for
When I
decades.
said earlier, when we opened the
Yes.
show, and I said how excited I was to be able to talk to you guys and take this stroll back down memory lane and come to modern times, the first time I ever came to see a movie, it was at the Lincoln Theater. And it was 1960. So I left the Lincoln Theater and came to Ben's Chili Bowl. And when I came to Howard University, one of my favorite eating spots was Florida Avenue Grill. And my wife likes to tell this story. I arranged our wedding. She was living in New York. We were going to get married where? At Howard University, at the Rankin Chapel. So that was going to happen. And it was Lee's Florist that I interacted with to do all the kind of flowers work. So to say that this issue and this matter that we're talking about is a part of my DNA, it ain't nothing but legitimate.
And that's what's so special, because all of us have, we're tied into it. It's part of our DNA. That's why we're so vested in preserving and curating this history. But going back to Kamal's point about the price of housing and what's really impacting the elders is the taxes. So if your family owned a home for 3-4 decades in U Street and other parts of Washington, D.C., and then the house next door to you is now valued at 1-point-something million, that elevates their taxes. And so many of them can afford, to pay those taxes and consequently are having to sell or downsize their homes because of that factor as well, because of the rising property values. But and also just to go back before we come to today, I just wanted to make a point about, because we're talking about segregation and integration in 1954, which really, after Brown versus Board of Education. But one of the really special things about the U Street Black Broadway era and that quarter was that it was integrated. African Americans, we're always about diversity. We welcome everyone, and so even though DC was very segregated, U Street and those clubs were integrated. I mean, you hear Armand Edergon, you hear about his story and how he integrated National Press Club and brought, musicians from diverse backgrounds together. But then you look at the Howard Theater, when it opened in 1910, it was integrated. It welcomed all audiences. Lincoln Theater, you mentioned, I believe in the promo, that President Roosevelt had his presidential balls and big parties there. And they were also patronizing the black artists and musicians that were performing along U Street
But
at
let's
that time.
also-
So
but
it was integrated,
it was always integrated.
Yeah, and I think that's
but
important
It was
to
always
talk about.
it was always a little integrated. White folks could always come to our place. We couldn't go to their place.
They always do.
We couldn't go to their place.
We're the innovators.
But
We
now when
gotta
you're talking
understand
about,
that.
but now when you're talking about, the Chili Bowl today,
Yes.
or businesses today, so and the dollar being green,
Yes.
so yes, it's great for us to be able to promote our culture and to be a walk down memory lane and to be a tourist spot that Obama came to. We have all this history. Street, the Chili Bowl.
Yeah.
But what about Industrial Bank?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
They, you know, even though they have that history,
Yeah.
it's a bank account.
Sure.
White folks don't use that bank. They have to compete on services.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
They have to compete on their product and on their service, on their location. Lee's Florist is selling flowers, and they have a lot of old black customers. People who can pick up the phone and call and order their flowers for their funerals or their weddings or whatever. But they have to also, you know, so you have to, if you're going to stay, you have to adapt. You have to find a product or a service or adaptable. If you're a black barbershop, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
If all the black people go.
You know what?
Right, you
Lord
gotta
knows
cut everybody's
we
hair.
can't have this discussion. We can't have this discussion without going back to the starting on the evening of April the 4th, 1968, when Martin Luther King was shot. And what happened to many cities across the country, but especially here.
DC was
I
devastated.
remember coming to DC with my brother. At that time, I had turned 16. I had a brother who thought he was tough, thought he, you know, he was a country boy. It was right when he was teased that they called him a Bama.
Right. That's a DC term.
That's a DC term.
That's
Yeah.
Mumbo.
And
Right,
especially,
Mambo.
especially y'all that come from Brandywine and
come
all
from
around
Brandywine.
that.
But I came up because we were seeing people looting, you know, and we seen people selling stuff on the street, man. So we wanted to get some jury.
Right,
And we came up and we
killing me
got
with the
some.
glossary.
Oh man, that jury. And I remember getting this watch that was sparkling diamond, gold, and
Yes.
everything else, and it was hot. We were riding back home, and before I crossed the DC line, I saw this like ink coming down my head. So it was the most fake thing I'd ever bought. But I will never forget, Ben's Chili Bowl stayed open.
Yes.
Yes, they do.
I will never forget seeing a Chinese place that was nearby. And there was artwork had been put in the window by the Chinese owner that said, "Me soul brother too."
Right.
So Sandra, give us your reflections on the riot.
You know, that was really a sad affair. When it broke out, well, actually, when they announced that Dr. King had been murdered, I was in my kitchen washing dishes, and my daughter is born in the same year as Kamal, you know. But my daughter was in her walker, and when they announced it, I just screamed because I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
But immediately, people went to the streets.
Yeah.
And when people are hurt, they do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. So they were trying to get back at an establishment by breaking windows and snatching things.
Spontaneous combustion.
And the streets of Washington, D.C. was just dangerous at that time because somebody who looked like you, who walked through the streets, they didn't know whether you were black or white, they would attack you as well. So it was.
And there was a whole lot of red bones in that
There was
area.
a lot of red bones in the area.
Right.
So, but I remember that they bought, Mr. Scher had came out of Southwest Scher's liquor store, and they had bought a liquor store on the corner of 9th and Varnum, and they broke the windows, and we looked in our yard the next day, and there was cases and cases and cases of liquor in our backyard because that's the only place that they could store it, but it was very dangerous. You know, it was very dangerous, and it was heartbreaking. And for years after that, when Kamal talks about the metro and the riots coming, for years after that, you could ride what we call a streetcar or a bus and come up Georgia Avenue or come up 7th Street, and the lots were vacant, and the smell, the stench from the burning was still there. And no matter what they say about Marion Barry, this man had the sense to get our city back in order by selling land to people for $1.
You know what?
For
so,
churches.
Sandra, we have folks that are looking in here that may not know anything about this, especially if they didn't see the movie Talk to Me about the life and times of Peter Green and his relationship with Dewey Hughes, which talked about this, which illuminated this. But that James Brown came in.
Yes.
And Peter Green was a part of something that sort of quieted the fears. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. And Petey was a very interesting person because he had come a long way. And I remember that James, because you know I worked for James for 2 years, and I remember that James came in and the people had so much confidence in him.
Yeah.
And his word.
Yeah.
And you know, James was a brilliant man.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was able to say stop.
Yeah.
He was able to calm the masses of black people.
Yeah.
And they stopped.
You know, and it was, and let's make sure that those who are looking in here today might understand this, that part of his incredible credibility at that time, 1968, is he had already come out with an anthem.
I'm black and I'm proud.
Say it loud.
I'm black,
I'm
and,
black
I'm
and
proud.
I'm proud.
That's
So
right.
that when he spoke, it resonated and it was appreciated and respected.
Yes, yes.
That was a pivotal night in DC history, because had the crowds continued to do what they had been doing, you know, days before, who knows what else, what other kind of
Well,
danger
but just
lurked.
and also that night though, you know, James Brown actually performed in Boston. You know, and then he came,
Yes.
you know, to DC
Yes.
a little bit later.
Yeah.
Because you know, as we
Yeah.
said, the unrest was happening. You know, it definitely impacted DC and Baltimore actually as well. But Boston, you know, he played an instrumental role, which, as we know, the segregation and the racism that was happening in Boston at that time also was, you know, just, you know, unprecedented.
So two things. I want to go from how U Street got its name, Black Broadway, to that's an exciting time. That's a time of happiness, joy, excitement. And I want to go from that to right now what is the struggles of one of the institutions of Black Broadway, and that's Howard Theater. So first, how did the name Black Broadway come about?
Who wants to take it? Well, Pearl Bailey.
Historian,
you know.
come on.
Well, I'm a
documentarian.
Storyteller.
Okay.
You know, but Pearl Bailey, you know, and many people, I think Dr. Truesdale alluded to it earlier when she was talking about Duke Ellington, the fact that a lot of people don't understand that this community shaped and molded him, you know, and made him the persona and superstar that he became. But same with Pearl Bailey. She migrated here with her father, who was a minister at Daddy Grace's church. It's my understanding she arrived here as early as 3 or 4 years old. Actually attended DC public schools, not far from here, graduated from Garnett Patterson Junior High School, but she was born in Newport News, like Ella Fitzgerald. And so again, when we talk about the importance of these communities and why they were so important, because they could only perform here. You know, African Americans couldn't perform on the Great White Way, Broadway. So Pearl Bailey dubbed U Street Black Broadway because of the Howard Theater. But it wasn't just the Howard and Lincoln. There was she performed at Republic Gardens, the Jungle Inn, the Casbah. She was also one of the dancers in the chorus line at Howard Theater. You know, because they were putting on elaborate shows. We always hear about the musicians, but they were putting on plays. You know, in the early 1920s, you had the Howard Players. You know, they were performing Shakespeare plays, and basically they used those plays as race plays to talk about what was happening politically, socially, economically. And so, you know, I think in addition to the entertainment, that's really the focus of the work that I'm doing.
You know what? So far here, we've talked basically about people who lived here, who were indigenous to DC and the rest, but Lord knows what those venues did. They attracted the best of the best of the black artists all over the country.
But not just the artists, you know, because again, we talked about some of the business leaders. We talked about the Alis, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Ali. We talked about the Lees. We talked about the Mitchells, and there were John Whitelaw Lewis.
And when you say Mitchells, you're talking about Industrial Bank.
Industrial Bank.
Sure.
But you know, when we're talking about when it became, you know, we're talking in the 1920s, 1930s. Many people don't know that by 1920, that U Street quarter had 300 black-owned businesses. That's significant, you know. And so, yes, the entertainment was everything, you know, but it was also, again, the fact that we had 300 black-owned businesses by 1920, and then when you look at what was happening in America at that time,
just think about that.
Yeah, just
300 black businesses in 1920. a thriving community.
Right.
But you know,
Decimated.
my
Yeah.
grandfather also told me a story about years ago, the whites trying to take over U Street years ago, and that there was another great protest and almost riot because the blacks came together and walked U Street with whatever weapons they could to say no, you can't take it over. I think if he could see it now, he'd probably die all over again. But
That was 1941.
But
actually.
talking about businesses, my father was a certified public accountant, and his office was right on 13th and U, along with Wilhelmina Rollard. And I often tell Kamal that my father was their accountant. My aunt. Irene had
And you talk about Wilhelmina Rollard, you got to talk about her husband Calvin,
Calvin.
and what they did. They were serial entrepreneurs
Yes.
that came up with the Black United Fund,
Yeah,
but
we're
that
talking
too,
even
came up with the
before that,
newspaper,
we're
But before
talking-
that-
and came up with the phrase.
Yeah.
before that they
Calvin
had
Rollard said, "I'm talking to Lottie Dottie and
everybody.
and everybody."
But Calvin had an answering service
Yeah.
before he had any newspaper. And when he met Wilhelmina, they got together, you know, and married, of course. But I, as a young woman, I babysitted his daughter, Denise, and because their answering service was on 9th Street.
Okay, and
And
let's
so-
keep the connection
These-
because you babysat the one who right now
Is
is the editor
at the-
of continuing of the
Denise.
black
Of her-
newspaper, The
Exactly.
Informant. Yes.
But what I was saying to you is, I came from a business family. I'm the granddaughter of an Iceman. My father, yes, was a graduate from Howard University, but a lot of people don't know about ice. They don't even know what you did with ice. My grandfather sold ice to
box.
people for ice box.
Yeah. That's
right.
And some people didn't even have an ice box, so they would buy a 25-cent block of ice and put it in a pan and put it outside their window so their milk and stuff and food could stay cold.
Yeah.
So having said that, I was just trying to agree that there were several black-owned businesses on U Street that did not really have to do with entertainment.
Yeah.
It had
Oh,
to
sure.
do with black people maintaining themselves throughout, their livelihood. So when I come out, I had the same experience as you did. But I had it just Saturday. I went to get my nails done. You know I like to be lovely. But I went to get my nails done. And I walked up the steps, and when I came out the nail salon, everybody between 13th and 14th on U was white. Except some of the brothers sitting over on the subway step and the Republican Garden steps. They were just kind of sitting there observing. But here's my thought. Don't stay away. Just because they're there. You know, so what if they're there? Keep coming. You know, I keep coming. I go into all the neighborhoods where blacks were, or where I go down on H Street to make sure that my presence is seen. You know?
Sandra, I've got to ask you, we've got about 4 minutes left here. Let's talk about the Howard Theater, which was one of those, proud institutions for so long. It went into disrepair. There was a triumphant return, and it opened, what was that, 10 years ago?
2012.
Just 2012? Okay, so 7 years ago.
Yes.
And now it seems threatened all over again. Give us a status report, please.
It is in disrepair. And again, Ben's Chili Bowl. The very first meeting we had about the restoration of the Howard Theater was at Ben's Chili Bowl. And we formed a committee called the Howard Theater Community Committee. And so we all got together, Raheem Muhammad, Salim Hilton, Jimmy Dugans, and I, and some other people got together on yesterday to talk about positive solutions to the problems at the Howard Theater. It is in disrepair. Not only is it in disrepair, but there's a concern about whether it's even going to survive or not. And this would be the second time around if that happened. So what we're doing is asking the community to come in with us. We put together 7 recommendations for Chip Ellis, and he's supposed to meet with us at the Howard Theater.
Chip Ellis, developer.
The developer, to
Howard
talk about
alum.
how,
Yeah, sure,
how
sure.
we are going to keep this theater active. The greatest mistake they ever made was to bring Blue Note out of New York City to manage a Washington, D.C. theater.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of problems there. I believe that we can resolve them, but we have to do it in a positive manner.
Let's end on a positive note.
Yes.
We've got 2 minutes left.
Yes.
Your family connection to Howard University is?
Well, my grandfather, as I mentioned, who was actually born in D.C., Georgetown, he attended Howard. He studied engineering, and actually he owned an electronics shop on North Capitol in Florida. At the time, it was Tivoli. It was actually a circle there. Dr. Truesdale was talking about marches. A lot of prominent African-American marches took place at that circle, and they marched through Rhode Island, U Street, everything. So, and then my grandmother.
So your grandma and granddad.
Well, my grandfather is a native Washingtonian. As I said, he
And
went
grandmother.
to Cardozo.
Okay.
And my father
Mighty
graduated
clerk.
from Howard
He's a
University,
clerk.
and of course, many, many friends.
Yes.
Sandra?
Oh, my father graduated from Howard University, though I'm the granddaughter of the Iceman. My mother graduated from Cardozo, and I'm a native, fifth
So
generation.
I wanted why did I ask that question? I wanted my viewing audience to just understand the vibrancy of those of you who have that connection to Howard University, because my goddaughter's in studio with us today. And after considering major institutions throughout this land, she accepted yesterday that she was going to go to Howard University.
You know.
Hey,
So,
you.
I call her Ella under the umbrella. Now, got to wrap up here.
Okay.
Folks, indeed I do have to wrap up. And that wraps us for this evening. For more information on this program or any other program produced by WHUT, go to WHUT.org. Thanks for tuning in. Goodbye, and may God bless you.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.